Hello everybody and welcome to Grup the Story Part 1. This is the first episode, so I'm going to be going through a few episodes with some growing pains. With this one, I'm experimenting a little bit with added sound effects. I don't know if they'll stay. You can let me know in the comments if you like them. I'd like to give a shout out to my sponsors. However, I do not have any, so thank you, Jack, for providing all of the time and effort, and thank you, Adobe Photoshop, for unknowingly giving me a free copy of your software. And without further ado, on with the show. Percival stared at the little black dot hovering over his desk. Years of studying the arcane arts and runes, which, in his opinion, was just science he couldn't explain yet, had led to this. A small, floating, black disc, the size of a quarter. It was a portal, or at least he thought so. Something came out of it. A slow drip of this viscous black ooze, which he eagerly collected into a beaker. As he burned the concoction, black wisps of smoke curled around the glass on the inside. It would have been artistic had he been one for art, but as a man of science, he had another use. He took a dropper and put little drips on paper slips, rolling them carefully and lighting the end. He took a long pull from his primitive cigarette, feeling the numbing effect. It was his medicine and his disease. Every time he inhaled, he could feel his lungs crackle and bubble. He couldn't quit. He wasn't sure if he wanted to. But dying was also certainly off the table, so what's the solution? Immortality? He supposed that was the most obvious answer, although the means to it weren't quite as clear. He stood up, pushing his chair back. Where does one find the secret to immortality? He said to himself. He looked around his dimly lit apartment, a faint darkness lingering over the entire space. Certainly not here, he said to himself. So he packed his bags, filling a burlap sack with everything he could need going out into the world. Well, everything he could think of anyways. He slung it over his shoulder and walked out the door. The sun burned his skin, absolutely blinding, and he found himself faced with that question that damns just about every adventure. Where do I go? Well, you could pick a direction and just walk for it. Although what are the odds of walking in a straight line and finding immortality? He decided that just standing there and thinking about it wasn't making him any progress. So he decided, without a plan, he was going to pick a direction and walk. The sun was still blinding his eyes, so he figured he'd go the opposite direction. Sun rises in the east, so he went west, right to the tree line of the Talwari Woods. By the time his fear kicked in, it was already too late. He was dead lost. He could hear noises behind every tree and bush, shadows creeping up behind him. He kept his head on a swivel. Why were the woods dark? It was the middle of the day. The anxiety was getting to his head, and the constant sounds of movement were driving him a little insane. He took another drag from what was once a pile of cigarettes, now reduced to ash. He was feeling woozy from how much he had smoked, but the anxiety was a little overwhelming. He leaned against a tree, and he felt some sticky substance on his hands. He examined the black ooze seeping out of the bark. It was familiar. This was the same stuff that he had been collecting in his apartment all this time. His addiction kicked in and he got excited. Euphoric even. Look at this. Growing out of trees? And here he's been toiling away in his apartment all this time. His euphoria came to an abrupt end when he saw a figure running towards him in the distance. Could be another shadow, a trick of the light. God, he hoped so. Better safe than sorry, though. He stood completely still. Maybe whatever it was, if it was, hadn't seen him yet. But no such luck. It kept coming. It was getting closer and closer. In a moment of panic, he opened up his bag and pulled out a knife. He knew he wasn't ready for whatever was coming, but maybe he could look like he was. As the figure got closer, he realized that it was a little girl, an elf. Now this was it. This is what he was looking for. Elves lived a long time. I mean, it wasn't eternal, but hey, 200 years is a fair whack closer to immortality than the 32 or so that he was shooting for right now. Once again, his excitement turned to disappointment when he saw the state of her. Bruised and bloody, clothes torn, and a look of panic in her eyes. She was banged up pretty bad, and she kept running, past Percival and hiding behind the tree he had been leaning against. He looked up to see what she was running from, and immediately regretted it. The trees started forming dark shapes from their silhouettes, moving shadows. How long had they been there? Were the things he was seeing out of the corner of his eyes actually following him? He didn't have too much time to contemplate on it, as one of those creatures started moving in. The two long arms were contorted so that it could crawl on all fours. Long, sharp fingers dug into the forest floor. Inky black sweat poured down its face. Where a mouth should be, a long red snout protruded, ending at a sharp point. On its back was a massive sack of what could only be blood, held together by a thin, fleshy membrane. It sloshed back and forth as the creatures walked towards him. He also noticed thin black smoke coming off of their bodies. The smell was unmistakable. This is the stuff he'd been smoking. His mind was abuzz as they came closer and closer. What did he know about this black substance? What could he do to fight it? Well, he knew it burned, so he whipped out a lighter and held it up defensively, but the creatures kept coming. Maybe that wasn't enough fire. He dumped all of his stuff out of his burlap sack and set it ablaze. The creatures still kept approaching. He figured he had to commit to something now. He couldn't just stand watching. He picked up the flaming bag, burning his own hands, and threw it at the beast. As it burned into its skin and evaporated into the dark vapor that had been seeping from its pores. Its scream continued long after it had died, echoing through the forest. That was one, but he could still see more coming. 5, 6, 7? He couldn't tell. They were dancing through the trees. From behind him, he heard the girl screaming. He quickly turned. She was being dragged by her shoulders out into the forest. In a moment of panic, he chased after and hopped on the back of the creature, digging his fingers deep into the blood pouch, which ripped with surprising ease. He noticed that his bag had started a much larger fire in the middle of the woods, and grabbed the girl, running for it. The other monsters lurked around him like a pack of wild dogs, slowly encircling the flame, getting closer with each rotation. He was running out of time. He whipped off his vest and wrapped it around a stick, placing it in the fire and making a torch. He got ready to run, but he couldn't leave the girl. He had already lost all the things that he brought with him, and he figured, at the very least, it'd be nice not to get eaten alone. He picked the girl up and put her over his shoulders. She was in a daze, but she held on pretty tightly for her size. He tried to wait for another opening, but the circle had tightened up too much. In a last-ditch effort, he ran out, holding his torch in front of him, hoping he would scare one away, but no dice. The creature pounced at him, and he drove his torch forward, digging it straight into its snout. He knew he was only moments ahead, but he couldn't keep going forever. In the distance, he saw a green light. Wasn't quite sure what it was, but he figured there's probably nothing worse than what he's running from right now, and sprinted towards it. He came to a single green torch, sitting in the middle of the woods, and collapsed. Looking over his shoulder for the first time, he realized that the monsters were gone. He pulled his one last cigarette from his pocket, tried to light it on the torch. He definitely wasn't going back for his lighter. To his surprise, the green fire sucked all of the black ooze out of the rolling paper. The flame quickly leapt up his cigarette and got onto his hand, setting it alight. He was surprised it didn't burn like fire should. It was freezing cold. As he looked at his hands, the burns on his palms were slowly healing. Without thinking, he placed his burning hands on the young girl. As he had hoped, her wounds started to close and eventually the fire went out. He sat down next to the flame, feeling just how exhausted he was, and collapsed backwards. The little girl tried to speak to him, and he did his best to understand, but it was complete gibberish. Shows how cultured he was. He'd never actually heard another language before. He just wanted to lie down and rest, but she didn't seem satisfied with it. She pushed and shoved and eventually turned to kicking until finally he'd had enough and got up. She took him by the hand, talking rapidly in a language he would never comprehend, pointing off deeper into the woods. She tugged at his arm, pulling him away. He wasn't very eager to leave this green flame that was protecting him, but he didn't want to sit next to that flame and slowly starve to death alone in the woods, so, "What the hell," he said, and followed after her.